The next morning, the mute lay groaning in the yard, his prostrate body aching all over, blood dripping from his mouth. The young master, interrogating him, stood with an iron-chained club in his hand. "Bastard!" The young master pointed at his wife's room, making all kinds of obscene gestures, but the mute only waved his hands. Before long, the club was covered with pieces of flesh, and blood flowed. The mute, his throat burning, was unable to utter a sound and just shook his head. He fell and vomited blood, but continued to bow his head, scraping his forehead against the ground. The soil was soaked with his blood. The young master tied the piece of lead to the end of a whip, swung it at the mute's chest, and pulled it back with all his might. The mute fell in silence. The young master was still not content. He ran for a sickle, the blade of which the mute himself had recently sharpened. He raised the sickle high. When the blade was about to strike, the mute grabbed the handle with one hand. Others rushed from inside the house to stop the young master. The mute wrenched the sickle from his young master's hand and threw it away. The old master took to his bed, mourning the fall of his house. He kept the door of his room closed and pretended not to see or hear anything. The family debated whether or not to cast the mistress out. That evening the mute was dragged out again. The young master gave him his clothes and shoes. "Go!" he barked. "You're not welcome in my house anymore." He glared at the mute and pointed into the distance with his finger. The mute was incredulous. There was nowhere else for him to go, no place to live. He had always believed that he would live and die in this house. He clasped his young master's legs and begged. Using gestures and facial expressions, he articulated a sincere and voiceless plea. But the young master kicked him aside and gave an order. "Throw the bastard out!" The mute was hauled out like a dead dog and thrown headfirst into a ditch. After struggling a while to get back onto his feet, he returned to the house, only to find that the gate had already been bolted shut. He pounded on the gate. In his heart, he was calling out to his old master, but his voice remained silent. The gate, which he used to open and close each day, now banished him. It would not open for him no matter how much he pleaded. All that he had managed and cared for was now turning against him. The reward for years of faithful service from his childhood till now, during which he had exerted all his body and soul, was eviction. In the end, he concluded that everyone he had trusted and relied on was his enemy. He had better get rid of them all, including himself. In the night air, the only sounds that could be heard were the crows of a rooster and the dogs barking. A flame suddenly flared up around the Sir O's house, once the mute's home. The fire, as if by design, spread along the grass and encircled the walls. Seen from above, the bright flame would have cast an arabesque of the house. Fire, like a demon's tongue, as it savors a morsel of raw flesh, engulfed the entire house in no time. Into this fire a man braved his way. The man was none other than Samnyong, who had been driven from the same house earlier that day. He first went to his old master's room, broke open the door, carried the master out on his back, and laid him on the grass outside. Then he went back again, not heeding the burnt, charring flesh on his face, back, and legs. The mute rushed into his mistress's room, but she wasn't there. He ran to the inner room, but she wasn't there either. Instead, he met his young master, who clutched at his arm and begged for his life, but the mute shoved him aside. Part of the rafter, now in flames, fell upon the mute's head, but he barely noticed. He went to the kitchen. On his way out, a doorpost fell and broke his arm, but he didn't pay attention to that either. He headed for the storage room. Even there, he couldn't find her. He returned to her room. Only then did he see her. He found her lying under a quilt, wishing for death. He gathered her up in his arms and looked for a way out, but there wasn't any to be found. Left with no other option, he climbed out onto the roof. He realized that he could no longer move his body freely, yet he also felt a sense of delight in his heart, unlike anything he had ever known. As he clutched his mistress to his chest, he felt fully alive for the first time. When he sensed that his end was drawing near, he embraced his mistress tightly and then bore his way out through the fire. He put her down outside, his own life already slipping away. The whole house had burned down, and the mute lay in his mistress's lap. Had his indignation died out with the fire? A happy, peaceful smile formed faintly on his lips.